When audiences first encounter Sarabi in Disney's The Lion King, she appears to be little more than a grieving widow, relegated to the background while her tyrannical brother-in-law rules with an iron paw. This surface reading, however, misses one of the film's most sophisticated character studies. Sarabi represents something far more complex and dangerous than Scar realizes. She embodies the quiet resistance of legitimate authority, refusing to bow to usurped power. The evidence of Sarabi's defiance begins immediately after Scar's takeover, though it requires careful observation to appreciate its significance. While other lionesses seem to accept their new reality with resigned compliance, Sarabi maintains a distinct psychological distance from the new regime. Her posture alone tells a story of resistance. She never fully submits to Scar's presence, never lowers her head in genuine deference, and consistently positions herself as an equal rather than a subject. Consider the famous confrontation scene where Scar demands she become his queen. The dialogue reveals layers of political maneuvering that go far beyond a simple romantic rejection. When Scar suggests that she could be his queen, Sarabi's response cuts straight to the heart of legitimacy. "I am not your queen." This isn't merely personal rejection. It's a direct challenge to his authority. She's essentially declaring that his rule itself is illegitimate, that he lacks the fundamental right to make such demands. The visual storytelling during this exchange reinforces the power dynamics at play. Sarabi maintains eye contact throughout their conversation, refusing to look away or show submission. Her physical positioning keeps her on equal footing with Scar, never allowing him the psychological advantage of looking down at her. Even when he moves closer, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate, she holds her ground. These subtle choices reveal a character who understands that resistance isn't always about direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about refusing to grant legitimacy to illegitimate power. What makes Sarabi's resistance particularly sophisticated is how she weaponizes her status as Mufasa's widow. Every time she invokes her late husband's memory, she's not just expressing grief. She's reminding everyone present that Scar's rule represents a break from the natural order. When she tells Scar that he's not half the king Mufasa was, she's doing more than insulting him. She's publicly declaring that his authority is temporary, artificial, and ultimately unsustainable. The drought scenes provide another layer of evidence for Sarabi's calculated resistance. While the Pride Lands suffer under Scar's mismanagement, Sarabi never publicly blames him directly, but her silence itself becomes a form of political statement. She allows the contrast between past prosperity and present suffering to speak for itself. Her refusal to praise Scar's leadership or make excuses for the deteriorating conditions creates a vacuum that others naturally fill with their own doubts about his competence. During hunting parties and private moments with other lionesses, Sarabi's influence becomes even more apparent. Though these scenes receive limited screen time, the evidence suggests she serves as an unofficial leader among the females. The other lionesses consistently look to her for guidance, positioning themselves near her during group scenes and showing deference to her opinions. This informal authority structure represents a shadow government of sorts, the legitimate leadership continuing to function beneath the surface of Scar's imposed hierarchy. The most telling moment of Sarabi's resistance comes during her final confrontation with Scar, when she openly challenges his competence as a ruler. Her declaration that Mufasa would never let this happen isn't just about the drought, it's about everything Scar represents. She's arguing that his fundamental approach to leadership is flawed, that he lacks the vision and wisdom necessary to guide the Pride Lands. This represents the culmination of her long-standing refusal to accept his authority as legitimate. Even Scar's violent response to her challenge reveals how deeply her resistance has affected him. His decision to strike her isn't just anger, it's desperation. Throughout their exchanges, she has consistently refused to grant him the respect and acknowledgement he craves. Her persistent defiance has undermined his psychological confidence in his own rule, forcing him to resort to physical intimidation when his political authority proves insufficient. The other lioness's reaction to this violence provides crucial context for understanding the broader political situation. Their shocked gasps and immediate protective clustering around their fallen queen reveal that Sarabi's resistance has been more visible and more influential than initially apparent. They don't react like subjects watching their ruler discipline a subordinate. They react like a pride seeing their true leader attacked by a usurper. What emerges from this analysis is a picture of sophisticated political resistance operating within the constraints of autocratic rule. Sarabi understood that direct confrontation would likely result in exile or worse, but she also recognized that complete submission would legitimize Scar's authority and demoralize potential resistance. Her approach represents a middle path, maintaining dignity and authority while avoiding actions that would justify extreme retaliation. The psychological warfare Sarabi wages against Scar proves remarkably effective. Despite holding absolute power, he remains fundamentally insecure about his legitimacy throughout his reign. Her persistent refusal to acknowledge him as a legitimate ruler creates a constant reminder that his authority rests on force rather than consent. This psychological pressure helps explain his increasingly erratic behavior and his obsession with gaining her specific approval. But what if this quiet resistance had evolved into something more active? What if the moment Scar struck her had become not just a symbol of his brutality, but the catalyst for organized rebellion? The moment Scar's paw strikes Sarabi's face represents far more than simple domestic violence. It constitutes a fundamental breach of the social contract that holds the Pride Lands together. In that single act of brutality, Scar doesn't just assault the former queen. He violates every principle of leadership, protection, and honor that defines legitimate rule in the animal kingdom. This moment could have served as the spark that transformed years of quiet resistance into open rebellion. To understand why this particular moment held such revolutionary potential, we must examine the psychological dynamics at play. Sarabi had spent months, possibly years, walking a careful tightrope between maintaining her dignity and avoiding actions that might provoke extreme retaliation. Her resistance strategy relied on subtle defiance, coded language, and the preservation of alternative authority structures. But physical violence against the former queen represented a line that, once crossed, fundamentally altered the political landscape. The immediate reaction of the other lionesses reveals just how catastrophic this moment was for Scar's legitimacy. Their collective gasp wasn't merely shock at witnessing violence, it was the sound of a social order cracking apart. These lionesses had grown up understanding that the role of the king was to protect, not to harm. Seeing their former queen struck down by the very lion who claimed to lead them created a cognitive dissonance that no amount of political maneuvering could resolve. Consider the psychological profile of the lionesses who witnessed this assault. These weren't passive subjects who had always lived under tyranny. They were lions who remembered prosperity, who had experienced legitimate leadership under Mufasa, and who understood the difference between authority and authoritarianism. The violence against Sarabi forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their current ruler was not just incompetent, but fundamentally dangerous to the very lions he claimed to protect. The power of this moment lay not just in its brutality, but in its publicity. Scar didn't strike Sarabi in private, where the assault could be hidden or denied. He attacked her in front of witnesses, during what was essentially a state meeting about the crisis facing the Pride Lands. This public nature of the violence meant that every lioness present became a witness to his fundamental unfitness for leadership. They couldn't unsee what they had witnessed, and they couldn't pretend that their ruler possessed even basic moral authority. From a psychological perspective, this moment represented what revolution theorists call a focal point, an event so clear in its moral implications that it forces previously neutral parties to choose sides. Up until this point, individual lionesses might have harbored private doubts about Scar's leadership while avoiding open resistance. But witnessing unprovoked violence against their respected former queen eliminated the luxury of neutrality. They were forced to either explicitly endorse brutality or begin questioning their allegiance to the current regime. The maternal instinct that drives much of lioness behavior adds another layer of revolutionary potential to this moment. In pride dynamics, lionesses are hardwired to protect not just their own cubs, but the social structures that ensure the survival of future generations. Seeing their former queen, a symbolic mother figure for the entire pride, subjected to violence triggered protective instincts that extended far beyond personal loyalty to Sarabi herself. What makes this scenario particularly explosive is the timing within Scar's reign. This assault didn't occur during his early days in power, when his authority might have seemed more secure. It happened during the depths of the drought, when his incompetence was already becoming impossible to ignore. The lionesses had already witnessed the Pride Lands deteriorating under his leadership. They had seen prey animals flee, water sources dry up, and their own cubs growing thin from malnutrition. In this context, violence against Sarabi wasn't just morally reprehensible. It was the final proof that their current leader prioritized his own ego over the survival of the pride. The psychological transformation that such a moment could trigger in Sarabi herself represents another crucial factor. Throughout her period of quiet resistance, she had maintained hope that the situation might improve, that Scar might prove capable of growth, or that external circumstances might resolve the crisis without requiring dangerous action on her part. But physical assault represented a point of no return, proof that peaceful coexistence with Scar's regime was impossible. Violence has a way of clarifying moral choices that previously seemed ambiguous. Sarabi's careful diplomatic approach to resistance had been based on the assumption that she could maintain her principles while avoiding actions that might endanger other lions. But once Scar demonstrated his willingness to use physical force against her, the calculus changed completely. Continued passive resistance now seemed not just ineffective, but potentially more dangerous than active rebellion. The historical parallel to this psychological transformation can be found in countless real-world examples of oppressed populations reaching their breaking point. The specific incident that triggers revolution is often less important than the accumulated weight of grievances it represents. Rosa Parks didn't refuse to give up her bus seat because that particular day was worse than any other. She refused because that moment crystallized years of systematic injustice into a single, clear choice between dignity and submission. For Sarabi, the physical assault could have served a similar function. All the accumulated frustrations of Scar's misrule, the environmental destruction, the alliance with enemies of the pride, the violation of traditional governance structures, the personal humiliations, could have coalesced into a moment of absolute moral clarity. The question was no longer whether resistance was justified, but whether she had the right to avoid it. The presence of other lionesses during this assault created additional pressure for action. Sarabi's response to the violence wouldn't just affect her own fate. It would signal to every other member of the Pride how they should respond to tyranny. Accepting the assault passively might preserve her own safety in the short term, but it would also teach the other lionesses that there were no limits to what they should endure. Conversely, responding with organized resistance would provide a model for principled opposition to illegitimate authority. The cubs present during this scene add another layer of moral urgency to the situation. These young lions were witnessing the formation of their understanding about power, leadership, and resistance. What they learned from this moment would shape their own responses to injustice throughout their lives. Sarabi's choice about how to respond carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate political crisis. But organizing effective resistance against an entrenched autocrat requires more than moral clarity. It demands strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to build coalitions among potential allies. This transformation from victim to revolutionary leader would require Sarabi to develop skills and relationships that her previous role as queen consort might not have fully prepared her for. The question becomes, how could a lioness raised in the comfortable assumptions of legitimate monarchy adapt to the harsh realities of underground resistance? Transforming moral outrage into effective political action requires more than righteous anger. It demands the cold calculation of a strategic mind operating under impossible constraints. For Sarabi to evolve from symbolic resistance figure to actual revolutionary leader, she would need to master skills that her privileged upbringing as queen consort had never required her to develop. The transition from palace politics to underground warfare represents one of the most challenging adaptations any leader can face. The foundation of any successful resistance movement lies in identifying and cultivating reliable allies, and Sarabi possessed significant advantages in this regard. Her relationship with Serafina, Nala's mother, represented far more than simple friendship. It constituted a direct link to the next generation of Pridelands leadership. Serafina's position as mother to a lioness who had fled the Pridelands created a unique dynamic where personal grief intersected with political opposition to Scar's regime. This connection provided Sarabi with something invaluable: a mother's rage channeled toward productive resistance. Serafina's daughter had disappeared during Scar's reign, creating a personal stake in regime change that went beyond abstract political principles. The psychological profile of a mother who had lost her child to political circumstances makes for a particularly motivated and reliable resistance operative. Unlike lions who might waver when faced with personal risk, Serafina had already experienced the worst possible loss, creating a fearlessness that peaceful lions rarely possess. The hunting parties that continued even during the drought provided perfect cover for resistance activities. These expeditions took lionesses away from Pride Rock for extended periods, beyond the direct observation of Scar and his hyena enforcers. The natural requirements of tracking prey demanded communication systems, coordination strategies, and leadership hierarchies that could easily serve dual purposes. What appeared to be discussions about hunting tactics could simultaneously function as planning sessions for more subversive activities. The psychological dynamics of these hunting expeditions created ideal conditions for resistance recruitment. Away from the oppressive atmosphere of Pride Rock, lionesses could speak more freely about their concerns and frustrations. The shared hardship of searching for increasingly scarce prey in a deteriorating ecosystem created natural opportunities for political discussions. When your cubs are growing thin because the king's policies have driven away the herds, conversations about leadership failures arise organically. Sarabi's intimate knowledge of Pride Rock's physical layout provided another crucial advantage for resistance operations. Having lived in the royal den for years, she understood the acoustic properties of different caves, the sight lines from various observation points, and the daily routines of both residents and visitors. This architectural intelligence would prove invaluable for planning covert meetings, avoiding surveillance, and potentially staging more dramatic actions if circumstances required them. The water sources scattered throughout Pride Rock territory offered particularly promising venues for resistance activities. Lionesses gathering water for their cubs created natural cover for brief conversations that wouldn't attract attention from distant observers. The ambient noise of flowing water could mask whispered communications, while the necessity of these trips meant that regular meetings could occur without establishing suspicious patterns of behavior. Storage areas within Pride Rock itself presented opportunities for more complex resistance operations. The various chambers and crevices that had once housed royal supplies now lay largely empty due to the general scarcity. These forgotten spaces could serve as meeting locations, message drop points, or storage areas for any materials the resistance might need to accumulate. Sarabi's familiarity with these forgotten corners of the royal complex gave her movement advantages that outsiders couldn't match. The communication challenges facing any underground resistance in a pre-technological society required creative solutions based on natural behavior patterns. Grooming sessions between lionesses provided perfect cover for whispered conversations, while the social dynamics of pride life created numerous opportunities for brief exchanges that wouldn't attract attention. The key lay in developing coded language that could convey complex information while maintaining plausible deniability if overheard by the wrong ears. The psychological warfare aspect of resistance operations required particularly sophisticated thinking, maintaining hope among potential allies while simultaneously preparing them for the harsh realities of resistance work demanded careful calibration of messaging. Too much optimism could lead to complacency or reckless behavior, while excessive pessimism might discourage participation entirely. Sarabi would need to master the delicate art of inspiring courage while maintaining operational security. The recruitment process itself presented enormous risks and opportunities. Each new member of the resistance represented both additional capability and additional vulnerability. The wrong choice could expose the entire network to Scar's retaliation, while overly conservative recruitment might leave the movement too small to achieve meaningful impact. Sarabi's reputation and relationships provided some screening capability, but ultimately she would need to develop new skills in reading character and assessing trustworthiness under pressure. The question of involving cubs in resistance activities created particularly complex moral and strategic dilemmas. On one hand, young lions could serve valuable functions as messengers or observers, since their movements attracted less attention than those of adult lionesses. On the other hand, involving cubs in dangerous political activities violated fundamental protective instincts and potentially exposed the most vulnerable members of the pride to terrible retribution if the resistance was discovered. The gradual escalation of resistance activities would require careful planning to avoid triggering premature crackdowns. Beginning with information gathering and communication network building, the movement could slowly expand into more active forms of sabotage or disruption. The key lay in maintaining a pace of escalation that built confidence and capability without provoking overwhelming retaliation before the resistance was strong enough to protect itself. The psychological pressure on Sarabi herself during this period would be immense. Leading a resistance movement requires accepting responsibility not just for your own safety, but for the lives and well-being of everyone who trusts you enough to join the cause. Every decision carries the potential for catastrophic consequences, while the isolation required for operational security prevents leaders from seeking the emotional support they desperately need. The intelligence requirements for effective resistance operations would push Sarabi to develop entirely new skills in observation, analysis, and strategic thinking. Understanding Scar's daily routines, the loyalty levels of individual hyenas, the locations of food caches, and the broader political dynamics affecting the Pride lands would all become matters of life and death for the resistance movement. But even the most sophisticated resistance network faces fundamental limitations when operating against a ruler who combines paranoid cunning with absolute ruthlessness. Scar's alliance with the hyenas provided him with enforcers who owed no traditional loyalty to pride customs or lioness sensibilities. His growing paranoia about threats to his rule would inevitably lead to increased surveillance and harsher penalties for suspected disloyalty. The greatest danger facing any resistance movement lies not in external opposition, but in the possibility of betrayal from within. As the network grew and activities escalated, the risk of discovery through internal compromise would increase exponentially, setting up an inevitable confrontation between Sarabi's carefully constructed underground network and Scar's increasingly sophisticated counterintelligence efforts. The inevitable discovery of Sarabi's resistance network would not come through dramatic betrayal or spectacular failure, but through the slow accumulation of small inconsistencies that paranoid rulers learn to recognize. Scar's survival instincts, honed through years of plotting his own rise to power, made him acutely sensitive to the subtle signs of organized opposition. The very skills that had enabled his successful coup against Mufasa now turned toward detecting threats to his own reign. The first warning signs would emerge from patterns invisible to casual observation, but glaringly obvious to a mind trained in conspiracy. Hunting parties that returned with suspiciously consistent stories about their failures. Lionesses who seemed unusually well informed about developments in distant parts of the Pride lands. Water-gathering expeditions that took slightly longer than necessary with explanations that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. None of these anomalies would prove anything definitively, but together they would create a picture of coordinated deception. Scar's hyena allies provided him with surveillance capabilities that the traditional pride structure had never required. Unlike lionesses bound by customs of courtesy and respect for privacy, hyenas felt no compunction about eavesdropping on private conversations or following suspicious individuals. Their outsider status within Pride society actually enhanced their effectiveness as intelligence gatherers. They could observe without being fully observed, gather information without triggering the social warning systems that might alert resistance members to increase scrutiny. The psychological warfare between Sarabi and Scar would escalate as each side probed for weaknesses while protecting their own vulnerabilities. Scar's growing awareness of organized resistance would manifest in increasingly subtle tests of loyalty and obedience. Royal audiences that seemed routine but contained trap questions designed to reveal knowledge that should have remained secret. Hunting assignments that separated suspected resistance members from their allies. Social gatherings orchestrated to observe interactions and identify communication patterns. Sarabi's response to this escalating pressure would require even more sophisticated political maneuvering. The ancient protocols of royal court life, which might have seemed like mere ceremony during peacetime, would become weapons in a psychological war for legitimacy. Her encyclopedic knowledge of tradition and precedent would allow her to challenge Scar's authority through seemingly respectful adherence to established customs that actually constrained his actions. The formal language of royal protocol provided perfect cover for coded resistance communications. References to historical precedents could convey complex political messages while maintaining plausible deniability. Discussions of seasonal ceremonies might actually coordinate timing for resistance activities. Debates about proper procedures for state functions could establish command structures and operational hierarchies without ever explicitly discussing rebellion. The symbolic power of traditional royal regalia and ceremonial practices would become another battlefield in this evolving conflict. Sarabi's continued wearing of certain royal ornaments or her positioning during formal gatherings could serve as silent signals to resistance members, while simultaneously asserting her continued claim to legitimate authority. These visual communications would be particularly effective because they operated below the threshold of explicit political action, while maintaining constant psychological pressure on Scar's insecure grasp on power. The role of the hyenas as enforcers created unique vulnerabilities in Scar's security apparatus. Their cultural isolation from pride traditions made them effective at detecting unusual behavior, but it also meant they often missed the significance of what they observed. A hyena might notice that lionesses were gathering more frequently than usual, but lack the cultural context to understand whether this represented normal social bonding or coordinated resistance planning. This cultural disconnect worked both ways, however. The hyenas' alien presence within Pride Society created opportunities for resistance activities that would have been impossible under traditional lion rule. Their inability to distinguish between normal Pride customs and coded resistance communications provided cover for activities that would have been immediately transparent to lion observers. The very alienness that made them effective surveillance tools also created blind spots that sophisticated resistance operators could exploit. The moral complexities facing Sarabi during this period would intensify as the stakes escalated. Every decision about resistance activities carried the potential for catastrophic consequences, not just for herself, but for every lioness who had trusted her leadership. The knowledge that discovery might result in exile, imprisonment, or worse for her followers created psychological pressure that few leaders ever experience. The weight of responsibility for others' safety while pursuing uncertain political objectives would test her resolve in ways that comfortable royal life had never required. The question of proportional response became increasingly critical as Scar's counterintelligence efforts grew more sophisticated. Each escalation of resistance activities risked provoking an overwhelming crackdown that could destroy not just the movement, but the entire social fabric of the Pride. Conversely, excessive caution might preserve individual safety while allowing the Pride lands to deteriorate beyond any hope of recovery. Finding the optimal balance between effective action and acceptable risk required strategic thinking that combined military planning with psychological insight. The intelligence war between the two factions would create a complex ecosystem of deception, counter-deception, and calculated revelation. Both sides would plant false information designed to mislead their opponents while protecting their own operational secrets. Sarabi might deliberately reveal minor resistance activities to convince Scar that he had successfully identified and neutralized the threat, while concealing more significant operations. Scar might stage apparent discoveries of resistance planning to test the loyalty of suspected conspirators and gauge the scope of opposition to his rule. The psychological toll on both leaders would mount as the conflict intensified. Scar's paranoia about threats to his authority would drive increasingly erratic behavior that undermined his effectiveness as a ruler while providing additional ammunition for resistance propaganda. Sarabi's burden of leadership would isolate her from the emotional support systems she desperately needed, while the constant fear of discovery would strain her ability to maintain the composed facade necessary for effective resistance leadership. The broader Pride community would begin to sense the underlying tension, even without understanding its specific nature. The atmosphere of suspicion and careful behavior would create a climate of fear that affected everyone's daily life. Cubs would notice their mothers speaking in whispers. Young adult lions would find themselves excluded from conversations that stopped when they approached. The social bonds that held the Pride together would strain under the pressure of secrets and divided loyalties. The economic deterioration of the Pride lands would accelerate these political pressures. As resources became scarcer and competition more intense, the luxury of maintaining elaborate deceptions would become increasingly difficult. Hunger and desperation would drive some lions toward reckless action, while pushing others toward betrayal of former allies. The environmental crisis would create a timeline that neither side could control. Conditions would eventually deteriorate to the point where political maneuvering became secondary to simple survival. The hyenas' increasing demands on the Pride's dwindling resources would create additional pressure points that both sides might attempt to exploit. Scar's dependence on hyena support made him vulnerable to their demands, while their growing presence in Pride territory provided new targets for resistant sabotage. The fundamental incompatibility between hyena pack dynamics and lion Pride social structures would create inherent instabilities that sophisticated resistance operations could potentially leverage. The endgame of this political chess match would ultimately depend on external factors beyond either side's complete control. The return of legitimate royal authority in the person of the rightful heir would change all calculations instantly. Environmental conditions that made continued resistance impossible might force premature action. The discovery of the resistance network might trigger immediate confrontation regardless of strategic preferences. As winter approached and the drought deepened, both Sarabi and Scar would recognize that their careful maneuvering was approaching its natural conclusion. The Pride lands could not sustain indefinite political conflict while simultaneously facing environmental catastrophe. The luxury of gradual escalation and careful planning would give way to the harsh reality that survival itself demanded decisive action. The final confrontation between resistance and regime would emerge not from anyone's strategic planning, but from the inexorable logic of a situation that had become unsustainable for all parties involved. The ultimate resolution of Sarabi's hypothetical resistance movement would depend on variables that extend far beyond individual courage or strategic brilliance. Historical analysis of similar resistance movements reveals multiple possible outcomes, each carrying profound implications not just for the immediate participants, but for the entire future trajectory of Pride Land's governance and social development. The most optimistic scenario envisions Sarabi's network successfully coordinating with Simba's eventual return, creating a two-front challenge to Scar's authority that proves insurmountable. In this timeline, the Resistance serves as an advanced intelligence network that provides crucial information about Pride Rock's defenses, hyena patrol patterns, and internal political dynamics. The lionesses' coordinated action during the final confrontation transforms what might have been a chaotic battle into a precisely executed coup that minimizes casualties while maximizing political legitimacy. This outcome would fundamentally alter Simba's character development and his approach to royal authority. Rather than returning as a lone hero to rescue helpless subjects, he would encounter a sophisticated resistance movement led by his own mother, a discovery that would force him to grapple with complex questions about leadership, gender roles, and the nature of legitimate authority. The psychological impact of learning that his mother had been actively fighting tyranny in his absence would challenge his assumptions about both his own importance and his understanding of political power. The alternative timeline, where Sarabi's resistance achieves partial success but ultimate failure, presents equally fascinating implications. In this scenario, the network manages several significant operations against Scar's regime, perhaps sabotaging hyena supply lines, coordinating information exchanges with sympathetic outsiders, or even staging limited rescue operations for political prisoners. However, eventual discovery of the network leads to brutal retaliation that devastates the resistance while strengthening Scar's paranoid grip on power. The consequences of failed resistance would extend far beyond immediate political outcomes. The psychological trauma of watching their former queen suffer punishment for organized opposition would fundamentally alter the pride's relationship with authority and resistance. Future generations of lionesses would inherit not just stories of heroic defiance, but cautionary tales about the terrible costs of challenging established power. This cultural memory would shape political development in the Pride Lands for decades to come. The most tragic potential outcome involves the resistance achieving initial success, only to fracture due to internal conflicts about strategy, leadership, or post-victory governance. Historical precedents suggest that underground movements often struggle to transition from resistance operations to actual governance responsibilities. The skills required for covert action against tyranny differ dramatically from those needed for transparent democratic leadership. In this scenario, Sarabi's network might successfully coordinate the removal of Scar's regime, only to discover that they lack consensus about what should replace it. Should power return to traditional royal succession through Simba? Should the lionesses who fought for liberation maintain some formal role in governance? Should the entire system of monarchical authority be reconsidered in light of its vulnerability to tyrannical abuse? These questions, unresolvable through military action alone, could easily splinter a movement that had maintained unity only through shared opposition to a common enemy. The gender dynamics embedded in Sarabi's hypothetical resistance movement carry implications that extend far beyond the immediate political situation. Traditional Pride Lands governance had always been structured around male royal authority, with female lions serving supporting roles in hunting, child-rearing, and social maintenance. Sarabi's emergence as a political leader would challenge these assumptions in ways that would reverberate through all aspects of Pride society. The historical precedent of lionesses organizing effective resistance against male tyranny would fundamentally alter future power relationships between males and females in Pride Lands culture. Young lionesses growing up with stories of their former queen's political leadership would develop different expectations about their own potential roles in governance and decision-making. The psychological impact of knowing that females could successfully organize complex political operations would shape gender relations for generations. The international implications of successful female-led resistance would extend beyond the Pride Lands borders. Other animal kingdoms observing the effectiveness of lioness political organization might reconsider their own gender-based power structures. The demonstration that traditional male-dominated hierarchies were vulnerable to female-organized resistance would provide inspiration for similar movements throughout the region. The symbolic importance of maternal authority challenging patriarchal tyranny connects to broader themes in storytelling and political theory. Sarabi's resistance represents the archetype of protective motherhood transformed into political action, a powerful narrative that resonates across cultures and historical periods. The image of the Queen Mother organizing rebellion to protect her pride's future speaks to fundamental human experiences of female leadership emerging from nurturing roles. Real-world historical parallels to Sarabi's potential resistance abound in the experiences of women who have led underground movements against oppressive regimes. From the market women of West Africa who organized resistance to colonial taxation, to the mothers of the disappeared in Latin America who challenged military dictatorships, history provides numerous examples of female leaders who emerged from traditional roles to challenge established authority. The specific circumstances of Sarabi's situation, widow of a legitimate ruler, mother figure to an entire community, possessor of institutional knowledge about governance, mirror the profiles of many historical female resistance leaders. These women often leveraged their cultural status as mothers and protectors to justify political actions that might have seemed illegitimate if undertaken by women without such traditional authority. The failure of Disney's original narrative to explore these possibilities reveals important limitations in mainstream storytelling about power, resistance, and female agency. By relegating Sarabi to a primarily reactive role, the film missed opportunities to examine more complex questions about authority, legitimacy, and the nature of effective opposition to tyranny. The choice to focus exclusively on male-centered narratives of heroism and redemption simplified political relationships in ways that diminished the story's potential depth. Contemporary audiences, increasingly sophisticated in their understanding of political dynamics and gender roles, might find greater resonance in narratives that acknowledge the complexity of resistance movements and the crucial roles that women have historically played in challenging oppressive systems. The archetype of the patient, suffering female victim waiting for male rescue feels increasingly outdated in a world where female political leadership has become commonplace. The psychological realism of exploring Sarabi's potential resistance would also enhance the story's emotional impact. The current narrative asks audiences to accept that an intelligent, experienced former queen would remain entirely passive while watching her kingdom deteriorate and her people suffer. This characterization undermines the emotional authenticity of her character while missing opportunities to explore the moral complexities that make political stories compelling. The deeper examination of resistance dynamics would also provide richer context for understanding Scar's paranoia and increasing brutality. Rulers who face no organized opposition often become complacent and incompetent. Those who confront sophisticated resistance movements typically respond with escalating authoritarianism that reveals the fundamental weaknesses in their claim to legitimacy. The psychological pressure of facing organized resistance from his own subjects would provide better explanation for Scar's deteriorating mental state and increasingly erratic behavior. The ultimate lesson of this alternative narrative lies not in the specific outcomes of hypothetical resistance operations, but in the recognition that political power relationships are far more complex and dynamic than simple stories of heroic. Individual actions suggest real political change typically emerges from the interaction of multiple forces: individual leadership, organized resistance, environmental pressures, and broader social transformations. Perhaps the most profound insight from exploring Sarabi's potential resistance lies in recognizing that the original story's focus on individual male heroism obscures the collective nature of most successful political movements. The narrative of Simba's heroic return appeals to audiences' desire for simple solutions to complex problems, but it also perpetuates unrealistic expectations about how political change actually occurs in the real world. The alternative timeline where Sarabi leads organized resistance offers a more sophisticated understanding of political transformation that acknowledges both the courage required for individual leadership and the collective action necessary for sustainable change. It suggests that real political progress typically emerges not from the actions of lone heroes, but from the coordinated efforts of communities working together toward shared goals. The true tragedy of the original narrative may not be that Sarabi didn't challenge Scar more directly, but that we almost didn't notice the resistance she was already offering. Her quiet dignity, persistent defiance, and refusal to grant legitimacy to illegitimate authority represented forms of political action that deserve recognition and analysis rather than dismissal as passive victimhood. In the end, The question of what might have happened if Sarabi had organized active resistance opens windows into broader conversations about authority, legitimacy, and the nature of effective political action that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single story. The hypothetical Queen's Rebellion invites us to reconsider our assumptions about power, resistance, and the complex dynamics that shape political transformation in both fictional narratives and real-world contexts.